Intel's Pentium 4. It's the big mistake that we've all heard about a few times now, with how they lingered on and eventually how it all ended. But today, why don't we find out how it all actually started? Now, this bit of content started a few weeks ago, because, well, these aren't all too common. See, when I say Pentium 4, your mind probably leaps to the likes of Socket 775, or for some of you, PGA 478. But no, before any of those we had Socket 423, and what can I tell you? Was it exciting? Was it impressive? Well, I can tell you it had a lot of buzzwords that might make it seem those things, but it only lasted around a year. So what is the actual Pentium 4 story? Just about 20 years ago, during the year 2000, AMD for the first time ever were being taken seriously as a competitor in the CPU industry. They weren't just giving Intel, the current market holder, a run for their money, they were damn near dominating the market, at least in terms of performance. Intel's aging Pentium 3 was still holding up pretty well and was a decent seller, but there was a degree of confusion over what Intel was going to do with the future. Were they going to take the architecture any further? Their CPUs tended to top out around 1 GHz, and AMD was rapidly gaining past this mark. So the answer was apparently clear. If there were billions to be spent, those billions were only going to be going in one direction, towards the supposedly architecture of the future, bringing us to November. Now, there are two ways to make a processor clock higher. You either make the CPU node smaller, so you can make the processor go higher in terms of clocks, or you can make the CPU do less per clock, thus meaning you can increase them higher. So what happens if you ever go doing both at the same time? That seemed to be the general consensus with the Pentium 4. Design a new architecture on the current node that would do less per clock, and then in the future it would get smaller and smaller and smaller. While everyone knows this part, the CPU was apparently going to reach well past 10 GHz. Well, more on that later. For reference, it never happened. But how do you make a processor do less in a clock? How does any of this actually work? Well, I'm going to try and explain this as simply as possible. And I've tried this script before, and I hope I've managed to get this down. See, imagine processors dealing with data as a bit like a pipe. Here is one that I've tried to pop up on screen. Let's say this pipe is made up of individual little pipes, hence the term, it's a pipeline. Well, if we make this pipeline longer, well, the processor is going to be doing less every clock because it's got to go through a longer pipeline before the task can finish, meaning it'll be doing less. So we can clock it higher, right? That's what Intel's idea was. Well, yes, but also no. See, this is where things begin to get very Intel, as it were, with big marketing terms coming up to cover parts that were going to be their downfall. Without getting too complex, Intel called this long pipeline, prepare yourselves, because this is a good one, hyper pipeline technology. So where was the downside to this? Well, when you make a pipeline incredibly long, a fancy name doesn't exactly mean it's good. See, when that processor is given a task, the processor tries to predict what happens stage to stage as it goes along this pipeline. And every time it ends up messing up, well, it goes back to the beginning. On an old Pentium 3, let's say you had 10 steps to go through on this pipeline. On the first generation of Pentium 4, it was 20. So for the Pentium 4 versus the Pentium 3, you've got 20 slow steps versus 10 fast steps. Are you guys beginning to see the problem yet? Well, of course, the Pentium 3 is going to complete the task faster, and the Pentium 4 wasn't exactly clocking high enough to make up for it yet. Still, when everything goes correctly to plan, with some things that are predictable like editing and rendering, server workloads and things like that, well, Intel's technology for branch prediction to predict what would happen next worked well. This was down in the term of the Rapid Execution Engine. There's a lot of fancy names they try to use here for a lot of very mundane things. Still, at least when the technology worked, it showed some promise. You know, it looked like it could be the future. Given all that we'd heard about the Pentium 4, it sounds like the technology might just about make sense. Some extra cache as things go forward might help the branch prediction, and the long pipeline means that we should actually see it scale up to high gigahertz, which isn't a brand name, that's actually just me trying to describe the gigahertz it was meant to reach. Problem is, this is a Pentium 4 that's still on the same node as the Pentium 3. They hadn't even had a chance to shrink it yet. So it was very literally huge. This thing is massive. But it's about time we summarise what this all means. and actually see the processor I'm spending all this time talking about. In summary, the core concept was slow. They used fancy brand names for technology to combat the slow problems, and in instances where it did work well, it worked phenomenally well, and we'll get touched on that later. We haven't even got started on the fact, though, that these things don't clock high. I've got one of the higher clocked ones, and it's not much faster than a Pentium 3 in terms of clock speed. And that's saying something, because the Pentium 3, well, it did a lot in a clock. This, not so much. Either way, I'm getting carried away with myself. I haven't even got started on the motherboards and things like that are already a pain in the arse. But let's take a look at the CPU itself. This right here is the slightly more exciting Pentium 4 with a 1.6 GHz clock. No model names, no other names really. This is the first generation, so all you really got to pick to decide your CPU was clock speed. Mostly ranging from 1.4 to around 1.7, and some slightly higher and slightly lower. That was all you really needed. Being based on the first generation Willamette core, they were extremely rudimentary implementations of the Pentium 4 technology, all on the outstandingly large 180nm process. This one runs at the already mentioned 1.6 GHz, being one of the later original Pentium 4s. It contains an outstanding 256 kilobytes of L2 cache, and only really uses about 60 watts under full load. It actually sounds like a decent bit of silicon from 20 years ago, but it rarely saw any use outside reviewers, and a few test labs that got a hold of them for certain tasks. It wasn't a hugely popular processor in terms of sales. But even then, the test scenarios which it was in weren't always in its favour. Which brings us back to what I was saying earlier about the motherboard. Oh yes, we've just about finished with the processor, but on release you just couldn't use this with any normal RAM. No, Intel provided you with RDRAM capable of running at 800 MHz in dual channel. This was in a time when SDRAM, the competitor, was running at a measly 133 MHz. In terms of actual bandwidth available, you had over 500 megabytes a second, or megabits per second, I'm not too sure on different places, they give me different figures, but still, it did show that you had a major increase in terms of bandwidth available to the Pentium 4. And in memory-heavy applications like rendering, the Pentium 4 has a stark advantage. It's just a shame that in virtually anything else, RDRAM has massive latency associated with it, that's often so bad that normal RAM actually works out better. Still, I thought it'd be nice to try and trawl down one whole gigabyte of RDRAM to give our little Pentium to feast on. I don't know why I call it little, this thing is a unit of a processor. So what is the Pentium 4 experience like? Was it as dire as the future ones? Or would the past actually give you something to believe in? The past being a 20-year-old processor. Today we're running Windows XP, no service packs, just straight up normal Windows XP, which is running up a 120GB SSD, which wasn't me repeating the word twice, that's genuinely the brand name of the one I opted for. I did test across a few operating systems, which I'll probably touch on later on in the video. Before we jump into the gaming benchmarks though, how actually is this system's use? Is this still the system of the future as it kept being touted? Well, from a general usability perspective, possibly. I've been using the system quite a lot recently just to put it to the test, and it is incredibly snappy. Even when I threw a Windows install onto an old IDE hard drive, it felt equally as snappy as the SSD I've also been using. Even when it comes to SSD usage, the system was pretty good even supporting it. It did need to be ran via an IDE to SATA adapter though, and I did opt to clone the Windows install over to it, as older operating systems can be a tad fussy with these adapters. But after all, that now 20-year-old system can handle high-speed storage alright, and the Pentium 4 adapts to it well. This was with a relatively high-end Asus motherboard, as most socket 423 motherboards that are still out there today are pretty high-end ones. Still, we could even check the temperatures running on the SSD. As for other areas, the Pentium 4 genuinely surprised me. At tasks like unzipping and compressing files, it was really good. I often find the netburst architecture can be shown in some very nice light, but I wasn't expecting this type of performance. I did some tests comparing against competing CPUs I had around, and the Pentium 4 really was starting off strong. When it came to tasks like video editing as well, the Pentium 4 was exceptionally strong still. I know it might seem mediocre by today's standards, but this was a multi-layered clip being rendered to a standard definition MP4 file, which is quite intensive to do, and it produced a rather decent looking bit of footage, given that it was only a test file. Compared to the Pentium 3 though, it seemed to be a great deal faster rendering, but this is the Pentium 4 in its element. Where things do actually go in its favour, it's doing simple and very predictable tasks. But the thing is, when you actually get into the nitty-gritty reality of the Pentium 4, this is the best case scenario imaginable, and even then, it can be more of a mixed bag than what a lot of people would really expect it to do. And it can do really well, as we've just shown. But sometimes, well, you'll have to find out where it falls down in the benchmarks. I decided to start us off with Halo Combat Evolved. It's a perfect early 2000s benchmark, as there were often complaints of it running less than stellar on some of the more beefy Athlon or Pentium 3 systems. So how well does the Pentium 4 compete? Well, in this instance, really rather well. The first and second levels of Halo proved to give good perspective on the card in both cramped environments and the large open ones where it has to render lots of AI and those large sprawling environments. And credit where it's due, this is some surprisingly good performance from the Pentium 4, and if you were showcasing gaming performance like this, I'd imagine a lot of people could be fooled into thinking it was a decent CPU. Moving on to another classic from the era with Morrowind, and we're already beginning to see mixed performance. It seems like in open areas the performance was actually superior to the Pentium 3s of the era and older CPUs, but when you're in towns and cities and the CPU's really being stressed, it was really rather dire, dropping below original Xbox levels of performance. For those of you wondering how all these compare, don't worry, I've done extra benchmarks and we'll be getting onto those later on in the video, but yeah, in some ways we saw better performance, just quite often not when the game really needed the frames. Like when you're in combat, in a busy area, you aren't going to be getting the frame rates you need. Running some Far Cry, it really was beginning to chuck. Performance did seem playable, don't get me wrong on that at all, especially with it being the crisis of its day. Still, there was always the chance of sub 30 FPS slightly more frequently than I thought there would be. Settings like shadows or anything that should be taxing the processor didn't seem to make a great deal of difference. But given the bandwidth that the processor has access to, I'm not all too surprised. It's more just processing all the AI that really a Pentium 3 or an Athlon can do much better than the Pentium 4. It struggles with it quite heavily. Finally, some more positive news is that some classics like Empire Earth, a game that no one ever really talks about but is a really fun game, will run perfectly fine even with the highest of detail settings and fully loaded maps with lots of AI. We're talking the big maps with lots and lots of computer players. Even through into the late game, the processor does a fantastic job with this style of RTS game. I'd imagine a lot of the optimized processing for AI really does give the Pentium 4 a lot of an advantage, as it's got that branch prediction actually coming into play for some optimal performance, unlike a lot of the titles that have preceded and what's about to follow. This here, with Fable the Lost Chapters, is, well, pretty dire. At first I thought there's no way that an early 2000s title as optimized as this would ever struggle on this Pentium 4. Well, at least not this bad. I went to the effort of changing over graphics cards with an X800 and Matrox Parhelia, both cards that should run this absolutely fine. In fact, I know they can run this absolutely fine. And there was just no change in performance because we were so CPU bound. Now, don't get me wrong, the performance is more than passable. I'll actually probably be speedrunning it on this system at some point in the coming weeks. But as it stands, the processor of the future is falling behind a few years after its release, and this game is an Xbox original exclusive in some ways, and runs perfectly fine on that. Half-Life 2 was another game from around the same time, something we usually associate with being easy to run, but today was not one of those days. In some levels and areas we saw an awesome 40 to 60 FPS, and starting off with that kind of performance gave me a fair share of hope that maybe Fable was an isolated case. But the issue with this game is that it's very physics heavy, and when you pair that with some large maps, or more intensive areas, we saw even single digit frame rates. With the Pentium 4, we see high highs, but some extraordinarily low lows. Really, we'd rather just have a stable average, and you're not going to get that on this processor. Now, this one really was a surprise. The Sims 2 Ultimate Edition really ran alright, especially when we were just playing the game. But it does have a fair share of content to load, and that's one thing I thought the CPU would do well. The Pentium 4 is good at loading and decompressing and doing whatever with data, it's very good at it. Still, it took absolutely ages. I probably spent more time loading the game than I did actually benchmarking it. And it runs fine on later netburst CPUs, but it really seems to struggle on this original series. Although it ran with a slightly higher on average frame rate than the comparing CPUs, once again it drops those frames fast. It's fully playable, but still the frame rate just felt like it fluctuated a bit too much. Gaming performance, well, it was a mixed bag. For the year it came out, some titles like Halo and Morrowind, it did a decent job in, and it kept up well with the Pentium 3 series, often with a higher, if slightly less stable frame rate. However, by the time I hit Half-Life 2, I was beginning to think that things just didn't seem right, as this was downright dire performance. And it did seem worse than even the original Xbox, which is what got me to bring that into the benchmarks for testing. Either way, I went through and got together as many decent benchmarks from processor to processor, just to show where this processor ends up. Often at times the processor could edge out the Celeron D and lower clocked Pentium 3, but as time goes on, even the lower clocked Pentium 3 I have seems to fare better against the newer and newer titles, even gaining ground on the newer Pentium 4s. And then you've got the original Xbox, a prime example of what a Pentium 3 can do in an optimized environment. It was continuously stable in comparison to the Pentium 4 series. And you could argue that if there was a Pentium 4 in the original Xbox, then maybe games would have been optimized for net burst and it would have been better, but even then you're stretching it a fair bit. Performance, even on an overpowered Pentium 4 system, just seemed mediocre when a 2001 console can come along and completely destroy it. The thing is, though, that the processor does more than enough in desktop usage. As mentioned earlier, it is incredibly snappy for office and workstation tasks. It does an exceptionally good job. Admittedly, a lot of the software that I've been testing wasn't around at the release of the Pentium 4, so it's from a few years later when things were a little bit more optimized for net burst, as it's around that early 2000s era. Even internet browsing over an admittedly slow USB 1.1 wireless adapter was surprisingly snappy given the 20-year-old hardware. I was expecting it to be a bit worse. Anyway, it seemed better than any Pentium 3s I'd used, and maybe it's down to the speed and quantity of RAM, where it matters a bit more than the latency. Still, in those types of tasks, it really does seem like NetBurst has an advantage over what came before it. The thing is, a few advantages when it's given the best possible hardware to use? Well, that's hardly good enough for the cost. Now though, we're reaching about the end of what I can say about this here Willamette processor. Honestly, I can say I wouldn't want one of the much slower ones, as I'm pretty sure you can buy these down to 1.3 GHz, which even though is a 300 MHz deficit, given how weak these CPUs are, they need all the clocks they can get. I don't think I'd really like to try one out though. Still, in the right light, like video editing for example, and generally just using it, I was amazed how snappy and quick these processors performed. I even had a go trying to render a 720p HD video on it. It didn't go well, but the Pentium 4 did it while the Pentium 3 sort of just crashed. The thing is, these things weren't cheap back in the day. The CPU was £150 when it came out. The motherboard, this decent Asus P4T example, was £160. I can tell you it's still not got much cheaper. And the RAM. Oh boy. One of the parts that helps give the Pentium 4 that tiny bit of an advantage, that RDRAM. Well, let's put it into perspective. Intel would give you 128 megabytes when these first came out, included in the box, as a reason to consider the Pentium 4 as an early adopter. Well, for this whole 1 gigabyte, it would have set you back, drumroll please, about £1,400. And even your power supply might have needed to be different just to support this motherboard and processor combination. I am using a 20-pin, a 4-pin, and even auxiliary power just to power this CPU. and I think you can get away with adjusting between these three, but even then, I wouldn't really recommend it, as the system just didn't seem all too stable when I tried this, so I don't really recommend doing that. By the time you add it all up and adjust for inflation, you're looking at a system nearing $2,500 to $3,000. For performance that can near enough be matched by a Pentium 3, a comparing AMD CPU, or even, number 3, an original Xbox. Still, I can understand that the plans for this were to scale up to 10 GHz, and really this Willamette core exists as more as a proof of concept to scale down. But the thing is, on this generation, power consumption and heat output were low, and that's pretty nice. It's easy to cool and easy to run. On this, I could see netburst going quite far. But as it stands, we know how history turned out, and it was never kind to the Pentium 4, leaving it a reputation that was well deserved, being hot, slow and heavy, because it didn't scale down well, and it never reached 10 GHz. A lot of things that this original generation really did well was showing that maybe things didn't need to be conventional, but it also ended up showing that conventional works better, because they ended up going back to a Pentium 3 based design with the Core 2 Duo and the Pentium M sort of things, which is a video for another day. Still, I hope you all enjoyed finding out about this CPU. I've had a lot of fun making it, but it has been quite the project. So thank you very much for watching, and good night. So I hope everyone enjoyed this video. There will be more content on this processor and motherboard combination, and RAM combination, coming out next week, where I'll be focusing more on the unique side of this system rather than the history side. So if you want to find out more, I'll catch you guys then.